The 1980s weren't just a decade of Thatcher, turmoil, and televised strikes. They were also the final stand for some of Britain's most iconic haulage heroes. While foreign giants like Volvo, Scania, and Mercedes tightened their grip on the UK market, a proud fleet of homegrown lorries soldiered on, often underfunded, overworked, and underappreciated. These weren't just machines, they were the backbone of Britain's roads, and yet, many of them quietly faded away, overshadowed by flashier imports and corporate mergers. Take the Seddon Atkinson 401, a proper brute that looked like it could plow through a quarry wall and still make next-day delivery. Underneath its sharp square cab was a Cummins NHC 250 or Rolls-Royce Eagle engine that growled through the gears. Drivers loved the space inside, the visibility, the mechanical honesty of the thing. It didn't have the polish of a Scania, but that was never the point. It was a British workhorse, plain and proud. But when Iveco took over, investment dried up and reliability issues crept in. The 401 disappeared from fleet lists almost overnight, not because it was beaten, but because it was abandoned. Then there was the Leyland Clydesdale, a name once spoken with the same weight as Bedford and ERF. Originally launched for rugged mixed use, the 80s versions were stripped down to meet tight budget specs, sold to councils and contractors who just needed a lorry that works. And that it did. But the Clydesdale was never flashy, it was never fast. And in an era when fleets were chasing turbocharged torque curves and cab comforts, Leyland's old workhorse got left behind. It wasn't that the truck failed Britain, it's that Britain moved on and forgot it ever mattered. You couldn't talk about the era without mentioning the Bedford TM, a true jack of all trades, often overlooked for its army routes and municipal paint jobs. But the civilian spec? It had promise. With options for Cummins or Detroit diesels and a roomy sleeper cab, the TM had a shot at long-haul relevance. It even saw limited export success. But GM's decision to shut down Bedford's commercial truck production in 1986 meant the TM never had time to mature. One moment it was being prepped for wide body upgrades and Euro compatibility. The next, it was pulled from the line. What should have been Bedford's comeback was instead its curtain call. Meanwhile, the ERF B series quietly clocked up miles from Dover to Dundee. With its distinctive ERF badge and a choice of Gardner or Cummins engines, it gave British fleets a sense of identity, a badge that meant something. ERF never tried to outgun the Continentals on flash. They built trucks for drivers who knew their way around a spanner. But as the 80s wore on and regulations tightened, ERF struggled to keep up with new tech. Fleet buyers moved on to turbo intercooled engines, automatic retarder systems, and ABS, things ERF just couldn't offer without outside funding. And in the end, that's what did the B series in. Not the roads, not the drivers, the money. And then there was the Scammell S24, built like a rolling fortress and used in military, forestry, and oil field operations. It was unapologetically British, big steel, big grunt, and zero compromise. While not as mainstream as the others, it became a legend in recovery fleets and remote outposts, places where breaking down wasn't an option. The S24 could outpull almost anything in its weight class, but it never received a proper civilian marketing push. As Leyland wound down Scammell production in the late 80s, the S24 went with it, another industrial casualty of corporate rationalization. These lorries weren't forgotten because they failed. They were forgotten because the system around them changed. Deregulation brought in foreign competition, manufacturer mergers lost focus on heritage models, and fleet managers, under pressure to cut costs, started valuing finance plans and fuel stats more than heritage or reliability. Yet for the drivers who knew them, who repaired them in laybys, slept in their bunks during snowstorms, and thrashed them up the M62 in fourth gear, these lorries meant something. They weren't just cabs and axles, they were part of a culture that balanced grit with pride. They were the machines that saw Britain through strikes, storms, and slow economic climbs. And when they were finally parked up, it wasn't because they gave up, it was because someone else gave up on them. While mainstream manufacturers fought over specs and stickers, there were a few trucks quietly keeping Britain's economy ticking, forgotten not because they weren't good, but because they were never given a proper chance. One of them was the Dennis Delta. Built for urban and municipal duties, the Delta was far more than a bin lorry. It had rock-solid chassis integrity, a tight turning radius, and a surprisingly refined cab for a mid-weight 4x2. But Dennis was boxed in, too big for artisan work, too small for haulage firms chasing big payloads. And while the Delta could have carved out a niche in short-haul freight or regional distribution, it got pigeonholed. Once councils moved to leasing imported chassis with more bells and whistles, the Delta quietly slipped away. If timing had been better, it might have become a staple like the DAF45 or the MAN 8.163. The Carrier Bantam Mk2, a leftover from the Roots Group era, still had life in the early 80s. Compact, nimble, and great for multi-drop delivery routes in tight urban zones, it was like the Mini of commercial trucks. But just like its passenger car counterpart, it struggled under the weight of corporate collapse. Roots had been folded into Chrysler UK, then into Peugeot Talbot. Carrier didn't stand a chance. No one wanted to invest in marketing or development. So despite having the perfect footprint for changing city logistics, the Bantam vanished. Not because it couldn't adapt, but because no one backed it to. The Albion Clydesdale Super 6, not to be confused with Leyland's later versions, was another unsung legend. Designed with Scottish terrain in mind, it handled gradients and rain-slicked roads with poise most trucks couldn't dream of. It had a 6x4 layout perfect for timber haulage, quarry runs, and rural deliveries. But by the time the 80s hit, Albion had already been absorbed into British Leyland and shuttered as a brand. The few surviving Super 6 models were quietly rebranded or scrapped, their legacy lost in the paperwork of mergers and closures. Ask an old Highlander though, and they'll tell you, that truck could climb a wall if you gave it half a chance. The Reeve Burgess Sherpa 350, built on the underpinnings of the Leyland Sherpa van, never got its moment in the spotlight. Lightweight, adaptable, and easy to repair, it was a favorite for builders, electricians, and agricultural deliveries. What held it back? The badge. The name didn't carry the same punch as Ford's Transit or even Bedford's CF. And when reliability issues hit the standard Sherpa van, the 350 got lumped in with the criticism, unfairly. In truth, it was better built and better suited to the real work, but in an era of fleet managers swayed by marketing brochures and bulk order discounts, it got brushed aside. The Sherpa 350 faded from roads and memories alike, a victim of guilt by association. And then there was the Foden 4300, the sleeper hit of the decade. Built with a steel cab shell, composite panels, and a bold squared-off design, the 4300 looked futuristic compared to its rivals. It had Leyland or Cummins engine options, ZF transmissions, and one of the most stable high-speed rides of its class. But Foden's timing was off. The brand was being pushed toward fleet sales, while drivers still associated them with military trucks and heavy-haul applications. Even worse, investment was being funneled into ERF and Leyland's joint projects, leaving Foden to fight for its slice of a shrinking pie. By the end of the 80s, the 4300 was barely visible outside of regional contractors, but those who had one knew the truth. It was a driver's truck, rugged and refined, and it deserved far more than a quiet phase-out. Looking back now, it's easy to romanticize these machines, but the truth is, they weren't perfect. They had flaws, they needed investment, they needed support, and in many cases, they were denied both, not by drivers or mechanics, but by boardrooms and accountants. They were the last generation of truly British-built commercial vehicles before globalization swept in and remade the industry. These 15 lorries weren't icons because of how many units they sold. They were icons because they dared to be different, to serve unique needs, to reflect the grit of the people who drove them. And while they may not be parked in museums or featured in haulage calendars, they live on in memory, in the minds of those who once leaned against their bumpers on rainy laybys, sipping tea from a thermos, proud of what they drove.